sometimes your functions may throw an exception. So in this lecture, we're going to look at register user function that takes a username. Now, if username is falsy, it's going to throw an exception. Otherwise, it will return an object with two properties, ID and username. So how many execution paths do we have here? 2. So we need at least 2 unit tests. Back to our test file. Let's add a new describe block for register user. Okay. Now let's write our first test case. So it should throw if username is falsy. Now, what are falsy values in JavaScript? Null, undefined, not a number, an empty string, number 0, and false itself. So none of these are acceptable as username. So technically, to test the first execution path, we need these test cases. We need to call this function every time with a different input and ensure that this function throws an exception. So here's an example. We call lib.registerUser, pass null, get the result. Now we need to assert that this function throws an exception. So we expect result to throw. However, this code doesn't quite make sense because we are not getting a result from this function, so we cannot expect that result to throw an exception. So when it comes to testing exceptions, we have to take a different approach. Instead of passing result here, we pass a callback function. So we use the arrow function syntax. In this function, we add the code that is going to throw an exception. In this case, it's a call to the register user method. So we cut that from here and put it here. Now, we don't need the result anymore. Okay, let's test this. So, npm test. All tests are passing, beautiful. Now, in this case, our test code is only a single line. So we can easily repeat this expectation with different values. However, in more real-world examples, sometimes your test functions might be a few lines long. In that case, you may want to use parameterized tests. Now, at the time of recording this, as far as I know, Jest doesn't support parameterized tests. So I'm going to show you an alternative approach. Let's define an array called args or arguments. Here we add all these arguments we want to pass to the register user method. So null, undefined, not a number, empty string, 0, and false. Now we can have a simple loop here, args. For each, we pass an arrow function. So A goes to, here we have the code block, and then move our expectation here. And finally, replace null with this argument. Now let's run this test one more time. npm test. All tests are passing. Now, before we finish this lecture, I need to clarify something. If you have experience with unit testing, you might have heard of single assertion principle. Some developers interpret this principle such that you should have only a single call to the expect function in each test. So they would organize this code in a different way. They would have multiple it functions or multiple test cases, and in each test case, they would test for one of these values here. If that's what you prefer, that's perfectly fine. In this case, it doesn't really make much of a difference because our testing logic is only a single line of code. However, if you want to duplicate this it function for a test case that is 5 to 10 lines of code, you're going to repeat a lot of code that is unnecessary. This single assertion principle is really about logical assertions. So conceptually or logically, we're talking about falsy. So if we pass any of these arguments to this register user method, this test case should fail. So in my opinion, there is really no need to split this test into multiple test cases. But again, if that's what you prefer, by all means, go for it. Now, finally, let's write the second test case for the happy path. So I'm going to delete all these comments. Here's the happy path. So it should return a user object if valid username is passed. So you can see I'm using descriptive names for my tests. I don't use test1, test2, test3, test animal, test register user. These names make no sense. So this time we want to call lib.registerUser, give a valid username like Mosh, get the result. Now, in the last lecture, you learned how to test objects. So here's one way. Expect result to match object. Now in this object, we want to have a username property. So username, that should be set to Mosh. Now let's go back to our register user method. We also have this ID property that is set to the current time. So I just wanted a positive number based on the current time. In our unit test, we can't make an assertion about the current time because the current time will be different from the moment we call this method to when we make the assertion. So back in our test, I'm not going to include the ID property here. Instead, I'm going to write another assertion. We want to assert that result.id to be greater than 0. That is sufficient to know that this object has an ID property that is a positive number. And again, look here, we have two expectations or two assertions, but these are logically about a single concept. We're making assertions about this object that is returned from this method. Now let's run our tests one more time. Okay, everything is passing. Beautiful.